Chapter 7. A dish best served cold. Before you embark on a journey of revenge, dig 2 graves. Confucius, circa 500 BC. Hunter becomes the hunted. Major Gross's departure for Britain in 1794 heralded 14 years of strife and bloody vengeance within the colony. MacArthur fought successive governors, Bligh fought successive crews, the Aborigines fought the colonists, and the Irish fought each other and everyone else. Governor John Hunter arrived in 1795, with orders to wrest power back from the junta. Hunter, at 58 years of age, was well past his use-by date. Now, before older listeners start writing outrage letters to their local newspaper, or anyone else who still listens to them, they should note that the average British life expectancy in 1795 was 40 years. Governor Hunter had no experience running anything more complicated than a ship, 3 of which he'd sunk. Philip had sent him back to London to be court-martialled for trashing the Sirius, and the new Home Secretary, the Duke of Portland, thought it would be best to offer him a job on land where he could do less damage. Hunter had an excellent sense of humour and loved music, painting and long walks in the woods, during which he indulged his passion for natural history. With this sort of profile, one would have expected him to have been overwhelmed with RSVP hits, but Hunter was a committed bachelor and misogynist. Portland had instructed Hunter to crack down on the liquor trade and ensure that landowners were assigned no more than 2 convicts apiece, whom they would feed and clothe at their own expense. Hunter failed to carry out these instructions as he had fallen under the spell of the charismatic MacArthur, who'd shown him a teetotaler convict taking all day to dig up a potato on a rundown public farm. MacArthur convinced the new governor that the colony would starve without happy drunks labouring for poor philanthropist farmers who could barely feed and clothe themselves, let alone provide snacks and trousers to the useless criminals they so generously employed. Hunter was initially blind to the depredations of the corps. Instead, he blamed all of New South Wales's ills on its women, whom he insisted were refractory and disobedient, and at the bottom of every infamous transaction in the colony. Women, Hunter insisted, frittered away their days doing unfathomable womany things while their menfolk toiled to feed them. They also kept having children who were even more useless than their mothers. Hunter begged Portland not to send him any more of these irreclaimable wretches and urged that the colony be converted into the world's largest man-shed, where a chap might spend many happy years without ever being nagged to put the bins out. Others, however, were preparing to move against MacArthur. The first blow was struck by Reverend Samuel Marsden, Reverend Johnson's new assistant. Marsden, who had been influenced by teetotal Methodists, was sent to minister in MacArthur's domains of Parramatta, where he preached against the corps' profiteering and distribution of spirits. With a ruddy face, piggy snout, melon-shaped head and the strength of an ox on steroids, a legacy of his early years as a blacksmith, Marsden was the sort of preacher who believed in long early morning runs and cold showers. If you weren't into self-flagellation, he was prepared to do it for you, rapidly earning himself the nickname of the flogging parson. He saw sin everywhere, gloomily reporting that riot and dissipation, licentiousness and immorality pervaded every part of the colony. Marsden, though quick to find fault in others, found it easy to forgive himself. He had accepted a generous land grant and spent most of his time tending his 4-legged flock while increasingly neglecting his spiritual one. And although he publicly railed against the evils of liquor, he paid his farmhands in rum. MacArthur, as Parramatta's magistrate, had rudely dismissed Marsden's demands to lay charges against Simon Byrne, a convict who had drunkenly abused Marsden on the Sabbath. Marsden had the last laugh when Byrne was stabbed to death 2 weeks later during one of his sermons. The Lord moves in mysterious ways. Marsden never forgave MacArthur for the Byrne affair, and the rivalry between these 2 headstrong men grew. Both had invested in the colony's first merinos, imported by Henry Waterhouse from the Cape of Good Hope in 1797, and the preacher was soon challenging Bodice Jack from both paddock and pulpit. Henry Waterhouse sold all of his merinos, deciding that his future did not lie in wool. Like some of his descendants, he was presumably more interested in fine cotton. Hunter, his admiration for MacArthur now waning, began to listen to Marsden, a brother misogynist, and resolved to return the magistracy to civilian control. Marsden replaced MacArthur on the bench. MacArthur took this badly and devoted his considerable energy to maligning Marsden and the other civilian magistrates. But he reserved his most vicious attacks for his former friend, Magistrate Richard Atkins, after Hunter proposed Atkins' appointment as Deputy Judge Advocate. Atkins was charming, handsome and the best-bred settler in the colony, the son of a baronet and brother to an admiral and a general. He was also a gin-addled alcoholic with a penchant for getting his kid off when drunk and had fled to New South Wales to escape his circling creditors. When Atkins accused 2 soldiers of turnip theft, MacArthur requested information about this heinous crime in a letter addressed to Mr. Richard Atkins. Atkins, insulted that he had not been addressed as Richard Atkins Esquire, refused the request and sniffily concluded, "It is further, sir, necessary for me to inform you that any letters directed to Mr. Richard Atkins will be returned unopened." MacArthur dragged Governor Hunter into the dispute, who advised him that referring to Atkins as a mere Mr. was clearly intended to mortify him as a gentleman or to lessen him as a magistrate. MacArthur responded that he could not mortify Atkins as a gentleman, as he was not one, but "a man so deeply plunged in infamy, a man so vile, a public cheater, living in the most boundless dissipation, without any visible means of maintaining it. I will prove that in his public and official capacity, drunkenness and indecency are almost inseparable from him." He went on to accuse Atkins of issuing false notes, highway robbery and indecent exposure while drunk. Atkins responded to these extraordinary, although probably accurate, charges with the most wonderfully vituperative letter in Australian history, accusing MacArthur of being "a dastardly coward, the baseness of whose heart even imagination, however warm, can hardly portray. Despicable littleness pervades your every action. Return to your original nothing. We know what you have been and what you now are, and believe me, an honest and industrious staymaker is a more honourable and more useful member of society than such a man as I hold you to be. Viper, you bite a file. The day of retribution will come, and believe me, it is not far off, when you shall be dragged forward by the strong arm of justice to public view as a monster of society, the assassin of all that constitutes true honour. You are a leper in reputation, and that you ought to be driven from the society and all good men, lest you should be infectious." Being a gentleman, Atkins signed this letter, "Your humble servant." MacArthur's charges against Atkins were heard by Marsden, who, recalling MacArthur's own lack of interest in prosecuting drunks, dismissed them. Atkins was appointed Deputy Judge Advocate and waited for the moment when he might strike MacArthur down. Hunter, who had now twigged that MacArthur was a wolf in merino's clothing, begged Portland to recall the corps to England, describing them as "a set of the worst, the most atrocious characters that ever disgraced human nature." 3 years after his arrival, he finally enforced the limit of 2 convicts per landowner, but he never found the courage to challenge the corps' trading or grog running. While Hunter was dithering, MacArthur moved to isolate him. Pamphlets were circulated accusing Hunter's steward, Nicholas Franklin, of trading in rum. Franklin committed suicide. George Johnson had been appointed Hunter's aide-de-camp. Hunter's lifelong bachelor status and interest in the arts have led some historians to speculate that he needed no help being camp. MacArthur had developed a dirt file on his fellow officer, and Johnston was shipped back to Britain on charges of paying a soldier in spirits. The hapless Hunter increasingly withdrew into the bush, temporarily forgetting his troubles by searching for new animals to sketch. It was during one of these trips that Hunter discovered the platypus, which he promptly killed and posted to Sir Joseph Banks. Hunter couldn't take a trick. When the platypus was unpacked in Britain, Hunter's fellow naturalist denounced it as a hoax, concluding that a Chinese taxidermist had sewn bits of a duck and a beaver together in an attempt to make British scientists look silly. Meanwhile, MacArthur was writing obsequious letters to Portland, claiming that the governor had ignored his advice that landowners should feed and clothe their convicts and had refused his generous offer to pay for the upkeep of 100 of the lovable rascals. MacArthur was not just economical with the truth, he bankrupted it. But MacArthur's lies were the sort of lies that Portland wanted to hear. On 16 April 1800, Philip Gidley King returned to the colony to tell his old comrade that Portland had sacked him for being a useless tit, and that he, King, was now in charge. Broken, Hunter returned to Britain and was given command of the HMS Venerable, which he promptly sank. MacArthur now had one governor's scalp hanging from his belt and had sworn to avenge himself on Marsden, Atkins and the other pygmies who opposed him. He had lived up to the motto of the kings of his ancestral Scotland, Nemo me impune lacessit, none shall provoke me with impunity. Interlude with the Bastard 2. William Bligh woke on the morning of 27 August 1791. The sun was shining, the seagulls were singing, and he had a lovely bunch of coconuts. If he were French, he would have thought himself suffering from déjà vu. If he were French, he would have thought himself suffering from déjà vu. Unpleasant feeling, isn't it? Bligh was again doing the Tahiti to Jamaica breadfruit run. Sir Joseph Banks was not the kind of man to admit failure, so he had ordered a second expedition. Neither was he the kind of man to admit he had chosen a complete tosser as expedition leader, so Bligh was again at the helm of a ship overloaded with both breadfruit and disgruntled sailors. But this time there was no Christian. Instead, Bligh had chosen his nephew, Francis Godolphin Bond, as his second in command. Bond's hero worship of Bligh soon made way for bitter resentment. He wrote to his brother, "Our relation has the credit of being a tyrant in his last expedition, where his misfortunes and good fortune have elevated him to a situation he is incapable of supporting with decent modesty. The very high opinion he has of himself makes him hold every one of our profession with contempt. He has treated me, nay, all on board, with insolence and arrogance." Bligh's men spent their long days at sea lugging breadfruit trees up from the hold to enjoy the sunlight and carting them back below decks at night. Bligh reserved most of the expedition's fresh water for the plants, while the parched sailors were reduced to licking drops from their leaves. Bligh finally docked in Jamaica 6 years, 2 voyages and 1 mutiny after he had first set out to deliver breadfruit to the African slaves. The slaves took one look at the fruit, turned up their noses and refused to eat it. There's just no pleasing some people. Pemulwuy and the amazing Technicolor Dreaming Coat. Bennelong had done all the things Australian tourists usually do in England. Visited St Paul's Cathedral, attended the theatre, boated on the Thames and stopped in at a museum where he was shown the preserved heads of Indigenous people from all over the world. He also learned how to box, play badminton and drink spirits. But his travel buddy, Yamarawani, had succumbed to England's miserable climate and awful food, and now it was time for Bennelong to come home. He hitched a lift with Hunter, returning to country in 1795. Bennelong wrote the first known letter by an Aboriginal on 29 August 1796, telling Philip, "Not me go to England no more, I am at home," a refrain echoed by generations of Australian backpackers. Bennelong's homecoming was a difficult one. He saw himself as a gentleman of consequence, and when his sister, Karangarang, joyfully greeted him as he disembarked from the Reliance, he berated her for being naked. He told his people he wanted to teach them to love one another and would no longer tolerate them cutting each other's throats like savages. Bennelong fought a younger man, Kurui, in an attempt to win back a lover, and insisted on settling the dispute with his fists. Kurui speared him in the back and got the girl. Bennelong drifted between two cultures and was at home in neither. The Eora accused him of black magic, and he wore out his welcome with Hunter when he speared a soldier who intervened in a payback dispute. He was beaten with muskets and dragged away, his one-time admirer David Collins branding him a most insolent and troublesome savage. Bennelong's sense of dislocation was shared by other Eora, who sought the comforts of bread, tea, sugar and spirits on the streets of Sydney. The colonists who had once looked on the Aborigines with patronising wonder began to see them through a darker, twisted lens. Sergeant John Harris wrote, "The whole tribe with their visitors have plagued us ever since, nor can we now get rid of them. They come and go at pleasure." Elizabeth MacArthur, who judged a people's worth by the standards of the debutante ball, reported that the natives are certainly not a very gallant set of people who take pleasure in escorting their ladies. If Bennelong was the broken heart of his people, then Pemulwuy was their fighting spirit. Pemulwuy, who had earlier disposed of John McIntyre, Philip's gun-happy gamekeeper, was a Darug man of striking appearance. A warrior and wise man rolled into one, Pemulwuy had a flecked eye and clubbed foot, and reputedly got about in a cloak stained with the pigment of each of the Sydney tribes. Pemulwuy's amazing Technicolor dreaming coat led to him being known as the Rainbow Warrior. An Antipodean Che Guevara who smoked colonists instead of cigars, he waged a decade-long guerrilla war against the invaders, setting fire to their isolated farmsteads, their fields, and less successfully, their sheep. The Aborigines, who had successfully set fire to things for tens of millennia, were confounded by the non-flammable properties of wool. Pemulwuy's attacks killed over 30 colonists, a blood debt that would be repaid with interest. The war on the Cumberland Plain was a war of survival. The colonists had built their farms on the richest hunting grounds and waterways, so the people of the plain were left to choose between starving, begging, retreating into the territories of hostile neighbours, or fighting back. Pemulwuy went for option D. Pemulwuy's ability to appear from nowhere, set fire to a surprise colonist, and vanish into the smoke scared the bejesus out of the settlers. He was viewed with superstitious awe, and it was whispered that firearms could not kill him. Pemulwuy was regularly shot and, despite having more lead in him than an architect's pencil case, would relentlessly pursue his enemies as musket balls filled the air around him. In 1795, a giant African convict, Black Caesar, smashed in Pemulwuy's skull. The colonists celebrated the Rainbow Warrior's death and were surprised when he came back bigger and badasser than ever, leading 100 warriors in an attack on Parramatta. Pemulwuy was shot, again, and captured during the Battle of Parramatta. An incredible 8 ounces of lead was removed from his body, and because the soldiers admired his fighting skills, they did not execute him on the spot. Instead, they chained him to a hospital bed so that he could recover sufficiently to be decently hanged. But Pemulwuy rose Lazarus-like from his cot, snapped his bonds and decamped at speed through the nearest window. While many Aboriginal people were drawn to life in Sydney, the cultural traffic was not all one way. The authorities were deeply disturbed by reports of Europeans in Pemulwuy's raiding parties and declared several men outlaw, including John Wilson, Bunboe, for assisting the Aborigines in their attacks. The ineffectual hunter never got to grips with the Pemulwuy problem, but Governor King was a beast of different stripe. He offered 20 gallons of rum and 2 suits of clothing to the man who brought him the Rainbow Warrior, dead or alive, and ordered that the natives be driven back from the settlers' habitations by firing on them. King's banishment of Aboriginal people from the settled areas was designed to turn the town Eora against Pemulwuy so they would inform on him. The Rainbow Warrior was finally sunk by Henry Hacking on 1 June 1802. The other Rainbow Warrior was tautologically sunk by French frogmen in Auckland on 10 July 1985. Hacking was a hopeless drunk, and the promise of a year's free booze provided a powerful motive for murder. He presented Pemulwuy's bullet-ridden body to Governor King, who removed the head, pickled it, and sent it to Sir Joseph Banks with a covering letter that read, "Although a terrible pest to the colony, Pemulwuy was a brave and independent character. Understanding that possession of a New Hollander's head is among the desiderata, I have put it in spirits and forwarded it by the Speedy." Banks started his impressive Aboriginal head collection in 1793. He gave the first head he received to the German skull nut, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, the father of scientific racism. Banks, being a botanist, was used to people saying it with flowers rather than pickled heads, and was thrilled by the originality of King's gift. He replied that Pemulwuy's head was very acceptable to our anthropological collectors and makes a figure in the museum of the late Mr. Hunter. Dr. John Hunter, no relation to the governor, was another skull-loving buddy of Banks. He was an eminent surgeon and anatomist and brother to William Hunter, who, along with the unfortunately named William Smellie, was the father of modern obstetrics. The Hunter brothers and Smellie are now suspected of having arranged the murder of up to 40 pregnant women to provide them with corpses for experimental caesareans, a serial killing spree that makes Jack the Ripper look like a rank amateur. Today, Sydney Aboriginal elders demand the return of Pemulwuy's head, which, despite being 17,000 kilometres away from his legs, has gone walkabout. Prince William has now agreed to search for Pemulwuy's missing head, so it's bound to turn up soon. It is ironic that the Sydney suburb of Pemulwuy hosts the New South Wales Police Force's Forensic Laboratory, which has one of the largest collection of human heads in the Southern Hemisphere. Pemulwuy's passing concluded the Eora and Darug people's large-scale armed resistance. King lifted the banishment order, allowing Aboriginal people to return to the settled areas. He had made his point. Aboriginal bravery and independence would be rewarded with an extended stay on a dusty museum shelf. Interlude with the Bastard 3. OK, the whole breadfruit thing had been a bit of a flop, but Bligh was not disheartened. As far as he was concerned, any voyage in which his crew did not set him adrift in the middle of the Pacific or make him walk the plank weighted down with coconuts was a success. In 1797, the crews of 16 Royal Navy ships mutinied at Spithead. The sailors had not had a pay rise in 139 years, despite inflation having driven up the price of rum, tattoos, prostitutes and other essentials. The mutiny was of great concern to King George, as he was at war with the new French Republic, and the British fleet was all that stood between him and a date with Madame Guillotine. Lord Howe, Admiral of the Fleet, invited the rebel leaders to dinner with his wife and ordered them a royal pardon, a wage increase and improved meat rations. The mutineers accepted the deal. Lord Howe is otherwise best known for disproving the ridiculous claim of poet John Donne that no man is an island. Meanwhile, Bligh was in command of the HMS Director at the Nore, near the mouth of the Thames. Just as the Spithead mutiny was drawing to a close, the crew of the Director and 25 other ships rose up against their captains. The deal struck with Howe was not enough. They also demanded that the King dissolve Parliament and make peace with France. The Nore fleet blockaded London, crippling British trade, and the mutiny's leaders urged their followers to defect to the French Republic. The revolution petered out when most of the sailors refused to sail for France. Bligh's crew were the last to surrender. Several dozen Nore mutineers were transported to New South Wales, which they considered a holiday in comparison to serving under Bligh. Alas, their fun in the sun would be cut short when the Bounty Bastard arrived in the colony wearing his shiny new governor's hat. The return of King. For the moment, however, the governor's hat still sat atop the balding head of Philip Gidley King. By 1800, wigs were so last century. Unlike Hunter, King was a family man, so much so that he had two of them. The saintly Mrs. King cared for one of the governor's bastard sons by his former convict housekeeper, as well as for her own children. A passionate advocate for the rights of little bastards, King converted Sydney's most expensive house into a school for orphan girls, which he paid for by imposing a 5% duty on imported spirits. The Australian welfare system was born, and its fragile roots were watered with rum. Australian governments no longer rely on alcohol to fund social services, as alcohol is addictive and contributes to a range of social problems. They now rely on gambling revenue instead. King also provided a social safety net for convict women, who before 1805 were left to find their own accommodation. As women had limited employment opportunities, this often meant moving in with a man who wanted someone to keep his kitchen clean and his bedroom dirty. Governor King gave women another choice. They could seek refuge in the new female factory at Parramatta. Samuel Marsden was initially opposed to the factory, which he regarded as a grand source of moral corruption, insubordination and disease. However, he became an enthusiastic supporter when he realised that A, the factory had the largest collection of spinning wheels in the colony, and B, he had the largest collection of sheep. Marsden's attacks on the colony's concubines, as he referred to unmarried women, became less strident when they proved a useful source of cheap labour. King had no formal orders from Britain when he arrived in Sydney, so he simply made them up and blamed Portland for his anti-Corps reforms. He reduced spirit imports, established a public warehouse that undercut the Corps, gave convicts to landowners who agreed to feed them, encouraged civilian trading, and increased land grants to settlers and former convicts. MacArthur was so unsettled by this erosion of the Corps' profits that he offered to sell his colonial assets to the governor for £4,000 and return to England. King desperately wanted to rid the colony of the man he referred to as the devil's nephew, but displayed uncharacteristic indecisiveness in seeking Portland's permission for the deal. The Home Secretary was amazed that a serving officer could amass such a fortune and refused the request. He wrote separately to William Patterson, the Commandant of the Corps, directing that soldiers be forbidden from farming. Patterson made sure he lost the order. The relationship between governor and entrepreneur rapidly deteriorated. MacArthur encouraged his fellow officers to refuse King's dinner invitations, which was about as rude as you could get in 1801. When Patterson refused to snub the governor, MacArthur told King that Patterson was behind the dinner boycott. He showed King letters from Patterson that were critical of the governor, and circulated private correspondence from Mrs. Patterson that showed her in an unfavourable light. Patterson challenged MacArthur to a duel. MacArthur loaded his own pistol in breach of duelling etiquette and blew his commanding officer away. He then crowed over Patterson's twitching body, which was considered poor form. King wanted to try MacArthur for creating dissension between himself and Patterson, but knew he would never secure a conviction before a jury comprising officers under MacArthur's thrall. So, as Patterson hovered between life and death, King sent MacArthur to London for court-martial, writing to the Home Office, "Many and many instances of his diabolical spirit has shown itself. He has been the master worker of the puppets he has set in motion. If Captain MacArthur returns here in any official character, it should be that of governor, as one half of the colony already belongs to him, and it will not be long before he gets the other half." MacArthur turned exile into a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. King had sent 3 copies of the charges against him to London. One with Captain McKellar, a Corps officer who had accused MacArthur of poor sportsmanship in the duel, one with Lieutenant Grant, and one with MacArthur himself. MacArthur, unsurprisingly, claimed he had never received the charges against him. Grant's copy was mysteriously stolen from his strongbox, and McKellar's copy sank with McKellar somewhere in the Pacific. The case against MacArthur had not so much collapsed as evaporated into thin air. He was gently chided for shooting a fellow officer, and King was reprimanded for sending such a useful fellow back to England. The stresses of office, exacerbated by MacArthur's circulation of lies against him back in London, were beginning to get to King. Mrs. King had to hide the Government House drinks trolley, as her husband had embarked on increasingly frequent port binges, aggravating his gout and leaving him prone to intemperate outbursts. The increasingly paranoid governor replaced his core bodyguard with convicts. Meanwhile, Napoleon had cut off Britain's wool supply. Although Sir Joseph Banks had been paying smugglers to run about the Spanish countryside abducting merinos for the king's flock, domestic supply was still insufficient to meet Britain's insatiable demand. Seeing an opportunity, MacArthur wasted no time in telling everyone that he was the only colonist who used sheep for anything other than immoral purposes. He, John MacArthur, sheep whisperer extraordinaire, would single-handedly save the British wool industry, if the government would only give him a measly 10,000 acres of the colony's finest grazing land and a few of Banks's prize merinos. It was a testament to MacArthur's charisma that ex-Governor Hunter was a strong advocate of this scheme. Banks, however, was having none of it. Having developed a visceral dislike for the oily officer, he announced that New South Wales was completely unsuitable for sheep farming and warned that exporting sheep was illegal. MacArthur, who by now had friends in high places, obtained an export exemption and defiantly bought 11 of Banks's merinos at auction. On the morning of 8 June 1805, Governor King was greeted by the sight of a smirking MacArthur parking his new ship, the Argo, complete with golden fleece figurehead, at the dock below Government House. MacArthur saw himself as the heroic Argonaut Jason, returning in triumph from exile with the mythic fleece that would cement his rule over his kingdom. MacArthur handed King a letter from Lord Camden, Secretary of the Colonies, instructing that MacArthur had immunity from prosecution for his past conduct, had resigned his military commission, was to be granted 5,000 acres of the colony's best land, and could choose 30 convicts to shear his sheep. King knew when he was beat. He shook MacArthur's hand and gave him the largest land grant in the colony's history. MacArthur named his new estate Camden in honour of his benefactor and planted an olive tree outside Elizabeth Farm as a gesture of peace. And because he liked olives. The peace would not last long. King was soon informed that he would be replaced because of the unfortunate differences which have so long subsisted between you and the military officers of the colony. He collapsed from nervous exhaustion and gout on the voyage home and died within months of his return. MacArthur, too, governors nil. Interlude with the Bastard Four. The bounty bastard had distinguished himself during the 1801 Battle of Copenhagen and been promoted to command the HMS Monarch. Although Bligh was once more in the Admiralty's good books, his crews continued to loathe him. One of the Monarch's midshipmen wrote that Bligh's manners and disposition were not pleasant, and his appointment to the Monarch gave very general disgust to the officers. In 1805, Bligh was court-martialled for abusing one of his lieutenants, and for tyrannical and oppressive and un-officer-like behaviour. The charges were found part proven, and Bligh was admonished to be in future more correct in his language. The verdict didn't worry Bligh, because as far as he was concerned, the officers who had found against him were a pack of useless Pandemonium. The colonists no longer viewed the Irish as genial village idiots who liked to drink. They were now seen as genial village idiots who liked to drink and murdering colonists in their beds. William Patterson's wife, Elizabeth, summed up the colony's fast-growing anti-Irish sentiment, recounting her fear of Irish private assassins breaking into our houses in the dead of night, in which they were all too successful in their own country. Britain had been deeply shaken by the American and French revolutions and the republics that emerged from their ashes. This all men are created equal and liberté, égalité, fraternité business was against everything the class-conscious British stood for. Terrified that the seeds of republicanism would take root in its green and pleasant land, Britain introduced harsh new treason and sedition laws. The Scottish martyrs were the first to be transported to New South Wales for crimes such as calling each other citizen. The non-violent martyrs advocating settling political differences over a nice cup of tea. They even offered to bring the biscuits. The colonial authorities viewed these original political prisoners as harmless eccentrics, allowing them to live in their own huts and exempting them from convict labour. The Irish, however, were an altogether different kettle of potatoes. The Irish were into violence in a big way, and the more sectarian the better. Ireland was riddled with not very secret societies whose members dressed distinctively in order to recognise each other. Unfortunately, this meant they were also recognised by the British authorities and members of the other secret societies that had sworn to eliminate them. In 1793, the Orange Boys, a militant Protestant organisation, split from the Peep of the Day Boys, a secret society dedicated to burning down Catholic farms. The Orange Boys, who wore orange collars when going out to beat up Catholics, grew up in 1796 to become the Orange Men. The Ribbon Men, a militant Catholic organisation, succeeded the Defenders, a secret society dedicated to burning down Protestant farms. The Ribbon Men wore green ribbons in their buttonholes when going out to beat up anyone wearing an orange collar. Sectarianism was briefly put aside when members of various Protestant and Catholic secret societies banded together with former members of the White Boys, an agrarian secret society whose members wandered about at night in bright white smocks, levelling ditches, setting fire to haystacks and hamstringing cows on those Catholic and Protestant farms that had not yet been burnt down. Ireland had many other boy-themed secret societies, including the Green Boys, Oak Boys and Steel Boys. Boyzone is not an Irish secret society. This new inclusive society of United Irishmen, led by the charismatic Wolfe Tone, was a militant republican organisation dedicated to burning down anything owned by Britain. It helps your revolutionary cred if you have a really cool name. Ernesto Guevara was known as Che. Salazar changed his name to Pol Pot, and Vissarionovich Djugasvili purged anyone who didn't call him Joseph Stalin. Wolfe's real name was Theobald. The United Irishmen wore brown coats and a distinctive cropped hairstyle, which led to them being known as croppies. When the British authorities started arresting anyone with short hair, the croppies responded by capturing British loyalists, giving them a haircut and turning them loose, thinking this would sow confusion in loyalist ranks. It just made them really mad. The loyalists retaliated by pitch-capping croppies, conditioning their short locks with hot tar, waiting for the tar to cool, and then tearing it off, complete with hair and lumps of smouldering flesh. The United Irishmen did not like this new hair care regime, and, with the support of 1,000 elegantly coiffured French troops, launched the Irish Rebellion of 1798. The rebellion was an unmitigated disaster. Although laws limiting firearm ownership had been repealed 5 years earlier, the rebels preferred to fight the British with pikes. The pike was a long spear that had fallen out of military fashion 150 years earlier, but the Irish were traditionalists. It was also considered traditional, when marching against cannons and muskets armed with only a pointy bit of metal, to die a horrible, albeit quick, death. The British regiments and their Orangemen goon squads butchered anyone wearing a brown coat and quickly put down the rebellion. New South Wales awoke to an influx of rebels. Most of them wanted to put their past behind them, but the colonists wouldn't let them. They were Irish, ipso facto, they were bloodthirsty murderers dedicated to bringing republicanism and sectarian violence to New South Wales. Hunter described the Irish exiles as extremely insolent, refractory and turbulent. King called them satanic, and Marsden opined, "The low Irish convicts are an extraordinary race of beings whose minds are depraved beyond all conception, and their whole thoughts employed on mischief." The fact that 80% of the Irish convicts spoke Gaelic and kept climbing into small wooden boxes with the colony's 3 convict priests, where they'd all jabber away in foreign speak, fuelled the suspicion that they were plotting something. The colonists drew no distinction between Protestant and Catholic. They tarred all the Irish with the same brush and then, for good measure, feathered them with the same chicken. This drew Protestant and Catholic closer together at a time when sectarianism was splintering the United Irishmen back in dear old Ayr. As historian Patrick O'Farrell put it, the colony's Irish banded together to defend themselves against the charge that they banded together. In 1800, one of the convict priests, Father Harold, informed Governor Hunter of a planned Irish uprising. Irish Republicans had been manufacturing pikes and planned to attack the church at Parramatta during Sunday service, when all the town's soldiers would be present and unarmed. Harold would not name the rebels, so Marsden decided to torture the information out of the colonists with the most Irish name. Paddy Galvin was illegally given 300 lashes to encourage him to reveal where the pikes were hidden, but said nothing, even when the bones of his back were laid bare. The rebel leader, Michael Quinlan, was eventually found drunk at dawn on the day of the planned attack, and the other rebels were rounded up and exiled to Norfolk Island along with Father Harold. In 1801, Britain dissolved the Irish Parliament and formally unified Ireland with Great Britain. The new Union Jack, bearing the cross of St Patrick, flew in New South Wales for the first time on 27 May 1801. The sound of pikes being sharpened carried on the Sydney breeze. In 1802, Irish plotters planned to drive captured English convicts into the guns of the Redcoats. Those who refused to die for the uprising would be shot by the Irishmen behind them. This revolution never took off, but back in Ireland, the United Irishmen had regrouped under Robert Emmet. Emmet was confident that this time his countrymen would defeat the British. Irish weapon scientists had just invented a terrible new device that would change the face of modern warfare forever: the folding pike. The folding pike was a hinged pike that folded in half, the Irish precursor to the flick knife. While this made the pike easier to conceal, the hinge tended to collapse when the pike was inserted into an Englishman. Unsurprisingly, Emmet's 1803 rebellion was a complete fizzer. The Irish love nothing more than heroic failure. It gives them an excuse to write melancholic poetry and gather in pubs to cry while singing tedious songs into their room-temperature beers. Inspired by Emmet's brave ineptitude, the colony's Irish gathered themselves to fail, or die in the attempt, or both. On 4 March 1804, Philip Cunningham, a United Irish captain, led 220 predominantly Irish convicts from the Castle Hill work camp in an attack on the nearby government farm. The rebels, who had seized weapons from their overseers, planned to attack Parramatta, execute government officials and settlers, plant a tree of liberty at Government House, seize a ship and bugger off back to Ireland. Things didn't go to plan. The rebels split up to ransack nearby farmsteads, where they seized more weapons and drank the farmers' rum. 2 of the pissed raiding parties wandered about in circles in the dark and never made it to Parramatta. Convicts at the other settlements didn't get the message to join the uprising, but informers alerted Marsden and the Corps. When the rebels discovered Parramatta was defended, they milled about for a while and then marched back into the bush. The Corps was now led by George Johnson, who had been cleared at court-martial of illegally trading in spirits and returned to the colony and the now matronly arms of Esther Abrahams. King had declared martial law, and Johnston had authority to shoot anyone who so much as said, "Top of the morning." Unfortunately, he only had 29 troops and 67 members of a civilian militia, while Cunningham now had about 300 men. Johnston did what any good military leader would do when outnumbered by a horde of desperate Irishmen. He persuaded Cunningham and William Johnston, another senior rebel, to parley under a flag of truce. He then held pistols to their heads and ordered his men to fire on the suddenly leaderless Irish. The Irish, who by now should have been used to the English not playing fair, broke and ran. Quartermaster Laycock slashed Cunningham in the face with his sword and left him for dead. The bodies of the 15 rebels killed in the Battle of Vinegar Hill were left to rot where they lay. A local Irish landowner dubbed this skirmish the Battle of Vinegar Hill in 1826, naming it after the battle in the 1798 rebellion in which the Irish Republicans got their asses completely kicked. Many of the surrendered or captured survivors of Vinegar Hill Mark II were flogged within an inch of their lives and sent to establish the harsh new convict settlement of Newcastle, where they were forced to dig coal for their British masters. Cunningham survived his wound, but was hanged from the steps of the public store at Windsor the following day. 8 other rebel leaders were also publicly hanged, some in chains, their bodies left to swing at strategically selected places throughout the colony. A grim reminder to would-be rebels that the Empire would always strike back. Irish malcontents made a couple of half-hearted attempts to attack the colonists over the next 3 years, but their hearts weren't really in it. Vinegar Hill had quieted the calls for Irish freedom, and it would be another 50 years before the Irish would again rise up to be soundly thrashed at the Battle of Eureka Stockade. The People versus William Bligh. With the Irish put safely back in their box, one would have assumed that the storm clouds of rebellion had passed over the colony. But political forecasters hadn't factored in Cyclone Bligh. Britain wanted a strong man capable of finally pulling the Corps into line, and Sir Joseph Banks recommended Bligh as firm in discipline, civil in deportment, and not subject to whimper and whine when severity of discipline is wanted. With Banks in his corner, Bligh got the gig. Bligh's wife mutinied and refused to travel to New South Wales, so Bligh took his 22-year-old daughter Mary Putland as Lady of Government House and her consumptive husband, Lieutenant John Putland, as his aide-de-camp. Ellis Bent, a later judge advocate for the colony, leeringly described Mary as
Very small, nice little figure. Rather pretty, but conceited and extremely affected and proud. God knows of what. Extremely violent and passionate, so much as now and then to fling a plate or candlestick at her father's head.
Bligh wanted to restore Philip's vision of a colony of smallholders, tending their turnip patches and taking turns to milk the communal goat. MacArthur, with his vast estates and deep pockets, was the living embodiment of everything Bligh publicly despised and secretly envied. Bligh put an end to the large pastoral grants that allowed MacArthur and his cronies to thrive. King had granted 60,000 acres during his rule. Bligh granted only 4,180 acres, 2,000 of which were to himself and his daughter. King had also backdated land grants to Bligh and Mary, which Bligh repaid by granting 790 acres to Mrs. King, which she rather indiscreetly named Thanks. Bligh mounted a concerted campaign to cripple MacArthur's various business ventures and ordered his prosecution for the illegal importation of stills. When MacArthur was refused an item from the government store, he wrote pointedly, "It would be better if he gave it to me and some of the other respectable gentlemen of the colony. If he does not, he will perhaps get another voyage in his launch again." MacArthur was not alone. John and Gregory Blaxland, Australia's first truly wealthy immigrants, also wanted to cast Bligh adrift. The British government had promised the brothers 8,000 acres and 80 convicts in return for investing £6,000 in New South Wales. Bligh gave them 1,290 acres and 23 convicts. Of the first 3 convicts provided, one was an old man with one eye and one arm, one was an aged asthmatic incapable of work, and one was an idiot. Bligh was not satisfied with alienating the pastoralists. He alienated the ex-convict traders when he jailed 3 of their most prominent members. He alienated workers when he imposed fixed wages, with any person asking for higher pay sent to the stocks or given 3 months' hard labour. He had already alienated the Corps, calling his military bodyguards "tremendous buggers, wretches and villains," and asking Britain to recall this "dangerous militia." But Bligh's relationship with Johnston was irreversibly damaged when the Corps humiliated his daughter. Mary had been causing a stir on Sydney's emergent fashion scene, as Mrs. Bligh outfitted her with the latest couture from London and Paris. The continent's it girls of spring-summer 1807 were all wearing French gauze, and Mary wasn't going to be seen in last season's dull linen. Europe's fashionistas also wore petticoats, which Mary deemed impractical for the colony's sweltering climate, instead preferring a pair of brief pantaloons. As Bligh and his daughter entered Sunday service, the harsh Australian sun illuminated Mary from behind, shining through her diaphanous gown and giving the colonial paparazzi their first celebrity rude bits moment. This is now referred to as doing a Brittany, or if the display is for grotesque self-publicity, doing a Lindsay. The soldiers attending the service exploded with laughter. Mary fainted from mortification, and Bligh introduced Johnson and his men to his extensive vocabulary of 4-letter words. But it was Bligh's cavalier approach to property that caused the most concern. Bligh ordered leaseholders to pull down their houses and vacate land adjoining Government House so that he might improve his view. While Bligh had refused the Blaxlands the convicts they had been promised, he found 80 spare ones to landscape his backyard. Bligh offered MacArthur compensation to quit land he had leased, but MacArthur refused and paid soldiers in wine to fence the land for him. Before they could begin, a government official arrived and informed MacArthur that he'd been ordered to take down any fence rails. MacArthur picked up a hammer and provocatively installed the first rail himself. When the fence was torn down and his fencing materials confiscated, MacArthur loudly denounced this and the earlier confiscation of his stills as government theft. No man's property was safe from the hypocritical dictator, he warned, an attack that resonated strongly with the colonists. Sydney people love real estate. It's all they talk about at dinner parties, and they were aghast at the thought that the government might seize their one-bedroom, no-bathroom hovel with double lock-up convict. Things came to a head in December 1807 when a convict escaped on one of MacArthur's trading ships. Bligh fined MacArthur, MacArthur refused to pay, and the ship was confiscated. MacArthur then refused to feed and pay the ship's crew, declaring that they were the governor's responsibility. Bligh now had a marauding band of starving sailors on his hands, and they were terrorising Sydney. He ordered a warrant for MacArthur's arrest on charges of unlawfully permitting his sailors to go ashore. MacArthur reminded Bligh that they were now his sailors and wrote of the warrant, "I consider it with scorn and contempt, as I do the persons who have directed it be executed." MacArthur was arrested and brought before the criminal court, which comprised 6 officers of the Corps and Richard Atkins. The 25 January 1808 trial immediately degenerated into farce. MacArthur claimed that Atkins was prejudiced against him and owed him money, and should therefore be removed from hearing the case. When the officers agreed with this argument, Atkins shouted that he would jail MacArthur. One of the officers retorted that he would jail Atkins. The soldiers who packed the public gallery cheered, and Atkins scurried away to consult the governor. Bligh demanded that George Johnston come and bring his men into line. Johnston refused on the grounds that he had been drunk the night before and had injured himself by rolling his carriage in Australia's first recorded drink-driving accident. MacArthur was jailed, and Bligh threatened to charge the officers who refused to hear the case with inciting treason. Bligh had just declared open war on the Corps. Johnson popped a barocca, travelled to the barracks and ordered his soldiers to spring MacArthur from prison. MacArthur, the Blaxlands and over 140 colonists signed a letter calling on Johnston to arrest the governor and assume command of the colony. On the evening of 26 January 1808, 20 years to the day after the colony was founded, George Johnston, the first European to set foot on Sydney's shores and the man who had put down the rebellion at Vinegar Hill, led 300 soldiers against Bligh in Australia's only military coup. There is now evidence that Bligh carried a mutiny gene. In 2012, the entire state of Queensland mutinied against Bligh's descendant, Premier Anna Bligh, giving her government the largest electoral defeat in Queensland's history. The rebellion against Bligh's rule is now known as the Rum Rebellion. Bligh attempted to characterise the coup against him as revenge for his efforts to curb the spirit trade, while Johnston and the other rebels maintained it was because he was an insufferable twat. In 1855, William Howard, a rabid teetotaler who blamed all of the evils of the world on alcohol, drank Bligh's rum-spake Kool-Aid and renamed the Great Rebellion of 1808 the Rum Rebellion. The name stuck. The Rum Rebellion was a curiously laid-back affair, with the soldiers of the Corps singing and playing musical instruments as they marched on Government House. The only armed resistance came in the small and determined form of Bligh's daughter, whose husband had succumbed to tuberculosis just days earlier. Shrieking with grief and fury, Mary assaulted the soldiers with her parasol. There is something quintessentially Australian about the 1808 revolution. The Americans have the midnight riot of Paul Revere and the Declaration of Independence. The French have the storming of the Bastille and the execution of a king. The Russians have Lenin, Trotsky and 6 years of starvation, terror and mass murder. We have a bit of a sing-along and a crazy chick with a small paper umbrella. When the soldiers of the Corps entered Government House, Bligh was nowhere to be seen. And so began a 2-hour game of hide-and-seek, which ended, according to the rebels, when Bligh was found quivering under his bed. Bligh must have wished he'd bought a futon, because despite his protestations that he was just hiding his papers, he was mocked for cowardice for the rest of his life. George Johnston now ruled New South Wales, and Esther Abrahams, the one-time Jewish single mother come lace thief, was the colony's First Lady. The colonists celebrated Bligh's fall with an all-night party, burning effigies of the bastard, tucking into giant platters of freshly roasted sheep, and drinking vast quantities of rum. Some find it disturbing that these events took place on Australia Day, but celebrating the national holiday with fighting, disrespect for authority, a barbie and a piss-up You can't get more Australian than that.